All right, hello everybody. Today I have got a book review for you. I read the book Colony Launch by Jon del Arroz. Now, Jon del Arroz is one of those people who is kind of a firebrand on social media, and he definitely takes sides. So I see a lot of, people saying, his stuff is the worst in the whole world kind of thing. And there are people who, also are on the side of defending him through thick and thin, and that's all fine, but I figured it would be good to kind of try to get something more impartial out there, something where I don't bring whatever his political proclivities happen to be into my assessment of the book. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Hopefully, I am mostly successful. With that prologue, let's go into the review. So, Colony Launch is a book that takes place in his. I guess he has like some kind of Aryshan War timeline or saga going on with multiple books. But this book, while it takes place during the Aryshan War, is actually focused on something a little bit different. It's focused on a group of people who are trying to basically get the hell out of there. There is an Earth kind of federation or empire type thing that manages multiple planets. There's some mild dystopian elements in there which are interesting, if a little bit neglected in the story. But this book is about a group of people who want to basically head over to the other side of the galaxy, to a place where there aren't any, warring factions. The Aryshans are an alien race that is at war with the human federation or the human civilization. And there's some additional aliens that are mentioned kind of in passing. XY or Xi aliens are something that's mentioned, at one point in the book, but they apparently are not really like a significant, political or social force at this point. So this group of people, about 10,000 people, they have decided that what they're going to do is they're going to use the funds of a, what would you call him, like a multi-trillionaire, business mogul. He's kind of like one of those visionary characters where he's like, let's get out of this nonsensical war and let's, go somewhere else where we can, be free and, be prosperous. And we'll spend 100 years in hypersleep for that purpose, kind of thing. It's a neat idea. It's something that we've seen before. It's not like it's super amazing or anything like that. There's a few interesting elements to it. For instance, there's something about this world where there's some kind of, quote, strange EM, electromagnetic radiation, that blocks comm signals around this world, which means that it's kind of isolated as well in some ways. This is a neat little idea, and you can kind of see the places where this might be going. Maybe there's some kind of, alien artifact there that causes electromagnetic emissions to be scrambled. Maybe there's an unknown alien race that's in control of that area and is trying to keep themselves hidden from these two warring factions. There's a lot of different ways that you could go with that, and that's kind of a neat little mystery to kind of have. Unfortunately, it's handled a little clunkily, for instance, and we're going to find that in a few places in the book. Kind of my overall impression of this book after reading it and then going back and looking over it again and kind of thinking about it for a while is that it's decent. It's not great, but it's got some interesting points. It's got some some points in it that are a little bit less well handled, I'll say. But here's an example of that. So apparently this planet and the area around it is shrouded in this EM radiation that blocks communications. That's great. Well, however, they have a picture of this planet, and they're like, well, we had deep space probes. Well, wait a minute. There is a faster than light technology. It's called a crystal drive. But assuming that these probes were using the same crystal drive that ships use, for instance, it's very strange that they were able to get a deep space probe there and back in a very short time. It's left nebulous, but the presumption is a couple of years kind of time frame. And yet it's going to take them 100 years to move people out there. There are ways that you could kind of fiddle this out in the story such as saying, oh, well, the crystal drive is dependent on mass, and so a lightweight probe can go a lot faster than this big ship that's going to be carrying 10,000 people. It would be interesting if some of that was explained in the book. It's not, unfortunately, so it's just kind of left as like a little place where things are a little bit incongruous, and you're like, well, wait a minute, whatever. You know what I mean? It doesn't damage the story too much. It just damages a little bit of my suspension of disbelief, if that makes sense. So this Earth Federation has some interesting kind of mildly dystopian elements. It's generally believable. I forget what they call it. It's like the Earth Federation or something like that, or like the human federation. It's a federation of planets that's run by humans. It's got some things that are perfectly believable. It has a very poorly run prison system that mixes violent and nonviolent prisoners. And it has the ability, it has a pretty solid grasp on like the propaganda aspects of media, right? Because these 10,000 people are saying, we're going to go across the galaxy and kind of do our own thing. And there's a pretty significant contingent of people in this, in this federation that are like, these 10,000 people are traitors. They are taking our 10,000 best minds to, some random place where they won't be under our control anymore. And certainly that is a little bit weird, right? Like, considering that this federation consists of multiple planets, we only see like 3 or 4 of them in the book, but the assumption is that a few dozen planets, right? And say a couple of billion people, a few billion people per planet. We're dealing with a human population of, let's say, 100 billion people, maybe a little more, right? For them to consider these 10,000 people leaving as vehement traitors is I think enough of an overreaction that we can kind of guess that there's something going on with the government being a little bit more grasping than it should be. The way that this book is structured is that there are 4 different story threads that kind of very slowly come together throughout the course of the book. The first story thread involves a man named Antony Lemkin and his wife. They are, or rather he is, the governor of North America at the start of the book. In, I think, the first chapter, he basically abdicates, saying, this war against the Aryshans is being mishandled. We really shouldn't be fighting these people. We should really be trying to broker peace between them, which I think is an admirable thing. In fact, I think Antony Lemkin is probably the most interesting character in the book. Unfortunately, it feels like a lot of that interestingness is not really explored very well. His wife is an interesting character too. Bethany Lemkin is very cool in the book. So he and his wife is story thread number 1. Basically, disgraced is the wrong word, but kind of like a retired politician, right? Who used to have a lot of clout, has a unpopular stance on the current government's policies, and is interested in doing things to kind of push his own what would you call it? Like his position on the Aryshan War and how diplomacy ought to be handled. It's a pretty interesting character. Thread number 2 is the multi-trillionaire business mogul. His name is Fabio DePino. He has a daughter named Kiyomi. They are. So he's kind of he's the visionary that said let's set up this ship and send it off to the other side of the galaxy where there's no aliens that we can detect, and let's start a civilization out there with 10,000 good, but we'll get to this in a point that they're not like the best of the best, right? Because it's a one-way trip. They're basically saying, yeah, we're going to have the ship and we're going to take the ship apart to start the colony. So there's no way for people to get back. You're all going to die of old age before anyone else gets happens to drop by and say hello. So people who are already in established positions of authority or positions of fame are not going to be the people that are volunteering for this colony launch, right? It's going to be people who are misfits in one way or another. and that is something that makes sense. It's reasonable, and Fabio DiPino's character is kind of portrayed as the open and charitable type, I guess it would make sense to say. Like, he's willing to give people a chance, whereas the rest of society might have kind of shunned them a little bit. So, he's one of those characters where he would be interesting if he played like a really important role in the story. Unfortunately, he and Kiyomi kind of float through the book, if that makes sense. They do a lot of things, or we see the fruits of the things that they are doing, but we don't really see them doing them that much. The most interaction we get with Fabio DiPino, or the most poignant interaction we get with Fabio DiPino is when he calls Anthony Lemkin to his house to basically say, we want you to help lobby for having the government let us go, right? Because this is another element of the dystopia, right? Is that the government is kind of not willing in general to let people leave its authority. Again, kind of one of those things that is dystopian but believable, right? It's not crazy, jackboot stomping nonsense, but it is at the same time something that could very well be something, the way that people act, in this time. So but that talk is kind of the best look we get at Fabio DiPino's character. Everything else is just kind of like, we just kind of get hints of his visionariness, which is okay. But again, it kind of makes him a distant character, if that makes sense. Like, we don't really feel like we're ever close to being in his shoes. And the same is kind of true of Kiyomi. She's a doctoral student at a university, which she kind of gives up to work on this project of her father's, right? She's organizing, planning. She's a young but young but intelligent scientist kind of character. She spends a lot of time doing modeling and engineering for the project, kind of thing. These two threads of the story come together fairly early on, say maybe a quarter of the way through the book. But the other two take a long time to entangle with the others. And those two are the story of Morgan Ezra. She is a military character who basically, her planet is attacked by the Aryshans. All of her friends get killed. She happens to be the one person who survived. She gets this horrible PTSD, and that kind of leads to her, going off to some random place and kind of living a leisurely but unhappy kind of life for a while. We get a lot of vividness with her character. Unfortunately, most of that vividness is kind of PTSD flashbacks, which makes for a bit of a downer, honestly. She ends up later on applying to be a member of the security detail for the colony, and that's how her story ends up later on getting entwined with the other characters. And then our fourth thread, and this is the one that is interesting but also has some significant holes in it, is a character named Dalton Ward. He is a prisoner in one of the Earth Federation's maximum security prisons, and he's there because of crimes that he committed that were like theft and fraud. And it's very strange, and not unbelievably strange, but strange to see him lumped into the same prison population as kind of, people who incite riots and murder and are multiple murderers, right? Nowadays we kind of assume that a person who commits theft and fraud is going to go to some kind of, secure but not not violent place, right? And so this is another dystopian element, is that all of these prisoners are basically getting thrown into this maelstrom of brutal murderers and rapists, and it's not doing anything good for their rehabilitation. quite the contrary, right? He ends up getting pulled into a prison gang called the Spiders, or the Spider Clan, that is led by a guy who we only get his name as Tarantula throughout the story. And he's kind of this criminal mastermind. He has a military background, left kind of nebulous. He seems to be, pretty crazy, pretty, he's not the kind of like murderer character who you think of as being especially thoughtful. He's more thoughtful than kind of the brutish prisoners that are just beating the crap out of people for no reason and smashing their heads with their fists, kind of thing. But he doesn't. He gives the impression, or at least he's stated in the book to be lacking significantly in self-control. There's a moment where he's basically, someone attacks Dalton Ward. The tarantula stops the attack and then starts beating the ever-loving crap out of this guy. And Dalton Ward says, stop. He gets the message. And the tarantula turns toward him in such a way that Ward is convinced that the tarantula might just kill him at that moment too. So, very violent character, more intelligent than the average career violent criminal. But like, if Del Arroz was trying to get us to believe that he was significantly intelligent and kind of a mastermind character, that's not the impression that I got throughout the book. There are some elements where he does things that seem mastermind-like. For instance, one of the issues that happens in this book is that Anthony Lemkin is basically enlisted by Fabio DiPino to lobby on behalf of the colony launch. And one of the things that happens is there's a negotiation, right? Where Lemkin goes to a place where there's a bunch of government people. He's like, yeah, we want like a non-binding resolution to support the colony launch, so that we know that you're not going to like chase us down and kill us or put us in jail right before we leave, kind of thing. And they're like, well, we'll do it, but we have a variety of conditions, and here's one of them. One of these conditions is that you take 2,000 prisoners from this maximum security facility, which surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, but a little surprisingly, Fabio DiPino accepts. He's like, yeah, we can probably figure out a way to deal with that. We just need to not have the violent criminals. We just need to have the thieves and frauds are probably more conducive to this. We'll figure that out, kind of thing. And this is in character for Fabio DiPino. I just want to remind everybody, because he does demonstrate that kind of openness to people changing, to people learning their lesson, kind of thing, throughout the story. And so, like, that part of it's not believable. What's a little bit unbelievable to me is how, this tarantula guy and all of his worst thugs managed to get themselves to the head of the line for this volunteering for this colony launch. Now, this is one of those things where you could kind of just chalk it up to the bureaucratic incompetence of the Federation. But I think it deserves a little bit more explanation than it gets in the book, right? Because in the process of vetting these criminals, there would be photographs, criminal records, etc., that would be outside of this prison system, right? It would be, well, this guy, we have records of this guy over on this planet killing these 3 people, and that's why we sent him to this prison colony. The tarantula might be able to bribe or intimidate or, convince the guards on the prison colony to falsify some records here and there. But it would be very hard to falsify that entire breadcrumb trail all the way back to the original, criminal conviction on some other planet. It seems to me highly unlikely that this kind of thing would be possible, and it's kind of glossed over in the book as like a fait accompli. Like it just worked. And that was another part of the book that kind of broke my suspension of disbelief, is that this thing was treated so blithely when it is actually a really, really complicated and difficult undertaking. You can come up with a way to make it successful, right? You can say, oh, well, he bribed him and he had a friend here and they went here and we changed these records and we did this and we did this and we did this. And then we changed the appearance of this guy a little bit. There's all kinds of things like that could be done. But unfortunately, it didn't seem like they were described, or at least not described to the point where I was kind of convinced in the book. I mean, in general, the story is interesting. I would say that if I had to criticize something, I would say that the characters are kind of bland. There's very little character description. The tarantula is described as looking a little bit more intelligent than the average prisoner, and that's kind of it. I don't have a picture in my head of what Dalton Ward looks like, other than they shave him. They shave his head and tattoo him with a spider on his head. I don't really have a good sense of what Anthony Lemkin looks like. I don't know what Morgan Ezra looks like. Kiyomi, I can guess she's probably half Asian. I don't know, right? This is one of the weaknesses of the storytelling, I think, that the characters kind of are described a little bit weakly and a little bit blandly. And, there are reasons why an author might do that, but at the same time, as a reader, I find it helpful to have some character descriptions that kind of cement in my mind, what a character vaguely looks like, as opposed to just a name and a job, right? I've been doing videos on the Ultima series, and this is a situation where name, job, buy is not acceptable for character description. So the other thing that I think is kind of missing from this book, or neglected in this book, is the Aryshans themselves. We get our initial scene of the situation that Morgan Ezra is in, where that causes her PTSD. And we get an extended action scene through the last third of the book that involves the Aryshans. But at the same time, I feel like they're neglected throughout most of the book. If there are ways, I think, to bring that tension in a more significant way that probably could have been done to improve the reader's perception that this war is actually a real thing and not something that's just far away, right? In a large, interstellar federation, you expect there to be kind of like a front, right? Like, oh, well, these planets are in dispute. There's battles going on here. There's battles going on here. At the same time, it would be reasonable for people far enough away to kind of say, hey, this isn't really affecting us too much because we're out of the line of fire. But I think Del Arroz tries to have it both ways a little too much, right? It would make sense for people on Earth, people at the maximum distance from the front, to be a little bit inured to the war and to the war efforts, because all of it's going on so far away. At the same time, the Ark, the ship for the colony, is built on this one particular planet, which is supposedly far enough away from the front that it's not going to, be a problem. But as you might expect, it does become a problem, and it would have been, I think, more believable if there were a few notions of oh, well, the front is moving, we lost these two planets, and someone saying, well, man, that front is getting awfully close to where our Ark is being built, kind of thing. Some elements of that could have made it. Could have kept that tension throughout the story a little bit. That maybe we're kind of on this race against time. Whereas the way that it's set up in the book, it kind of gives you the feeling that there's some kind of mystery box going on. Because we've already established a mystery box for the target planet. It's got this nebulous EM radiation jamming around it, and then we have the Aryshans, who typically, from what we're told in the book, do not attack civilian targets, suddenly attacking this Ark ship that is, ostensibly a civilian target. There's very little communication. We're led to believe that there's very little communication between the Aryshans and the humans, and that it's a species-based, conflict. And so it's kind of hard to believe that, or at least I think it would have been better if there was a little bit more detail as to how and or why the Aryshans decided to attack this civilian ark, or how they knew about it, or something like that. It's left nebulous and mysterious in this book, but if this mystery box opens up in the way that I expect it to, that like, oh, there's some kind of secret that the Aryshans are trying to prevent humanity from falling into, some kind of trap or some kind of ancient civilization that all that's left of them are AI robots that defend certain areas and then find where the kind of a Mass Effect type of situation kind of thing or something like that, right? I'm kind of expecting that kind of thing. But then at the very end of the story, we get them landing on the colony, and they're like, well, if the Aryshans were defending this particular planet or this particular area of the galaxy for some reason, you'd think they'd have a presence there, right? And so it'd be like, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't they have just gone there first, or how would they have made it if this mystery box is going to open up the way that I expect it to? Which means that I'm probably wrong about how this mystery box is resolved, but at the same time, there's kind of a weird tension there where I'm like, what's going on here, right? It feels like there could be some narrative elements inserted in there that make it a little bit more sensible, make a little bit more sense. Yeah, so that's basically what I have. I did a little bit of math about this, and I was thinking about it because they have these FTL drives. And they're not particularly clear about how FTL they are. Are we going light speed plus epsilon, or are we going 10 times light speed, or are we going 100 times light speed, or 1,000 times light speed? Because there's also another element to this that kind of bugged me, just like from a numerical perspective. And here we're going to get into a little bit of me being a science nerd thing. But the Milky Way galaxy, based on what I've looked up, is around 100,000 light years in diameter. The Earth is kind of far out on the edge of one of the spiral thingamajigs, and so like we might expect that the ship needs to go 100,000 light years or something like that. Fair enough. Now, the sense is that it's going to take 100 years to do so. Fair enough. However, what we get in part of the story is people moving from Earth to the place where the Ark is being built. And the impression that we get is that this trip takes a couple of days, right? So if we assume that this passenger ship that's going from Earth to this other planet, I think Toltaire is what it's called, or this other system called Toltaire, takes a couple of days, how far apart can Earth, can Sol and Toltaire be apart from each other and have the thing still make sense to have a 100-year trip, right? Like, basically, if the galaxy is 100,000 light years across, then FTL must be less than 100 times C in order to, make this sensible, right? Otherwise, you'd end up in 100 years way further out than the edge of the galaxy, the other side of the galaxy. And so if this takes just a couple of days, and they're moving at, let's say they're moving at 100 at 100,000. Let's say they're moving at 100 times C. So 100 times 100 is not 1,000 times C, right? 100 years at 100 times 100 is 10,000. So that math works out. In a couple of days, let's say 3 days, right? 3 days would be one 100th of a year. So you've gone 1 light year in that period. Well, the closest star system to Earth, to Sol, is Proxima Centauri, and that's about 4.25 light years away, something like that. And so, well, then we need at least a trip that takes 12 days, so 2 weeks, a fortnight, in order to get to Proxima Centauri. But they're not necessarily going to the nearest planet or the nearest star system to Earth. They're going somewhere even further away than that. And so, the implication is that this trip from Earth to Tolterre must have taken months if they need 100 years to get from one side of the galaxy to the other. I don't know. This is just one of those things that bugs me, is when like scales don't quite work out, and you gotta kind of either like cobble them together and say, oh well, the colony ship is way slower than a passenger ship because reasons. If that were true, then it would be nice to have like oh yeah, this thing's bare bones. Our crystal drive is not the fastest crystal drive that there is. And that's why it's going to take us 100 years, as opposed to like if we had just taken a passenger ship, hypothetically, and driven it across the galaxy, it would only take us 10 years. But we're going to need to go slower because we've got more weight, or we've got a weaker crystal drive, so that we don't have to waste those resources, kind of thing. I don't know. It's one of those things that bugs me in science fiction when distances just don't seem to make sense. Times and distances are important. So yeah, that's kind of my review of this book. Pacing is a little bit slow. The fourth story threads that eventually kind of meet all together can be a problem for some readers. It's certainly a bit of a problem for me. That's, that was one of my worries when I started reading The Black Crown, right? Was that these different story threads were going to take forever to get back together. In this book, it takes a quarter of the book for two of the story threads to come together, and then the third and the fourth meet up with the first two, like 2/3 of the way through the book. And so the pacing is kind of slow. You can enjoy that maybe depending on your particular preferences. I found it to be a little bit slow for my tastes. The character descriptions are a little weak, a little bland sometimes. There's a lot of negative emotion in the book, if that makes sense. Most of the characters, the things that cause them to have the most powerful reactions, and I'm not saying this is unrealistic, but like we see all the characters being sad and dejected and depressed, but we don't get to see the other side of that in a significant way. We get a little bit of that with Anthony Lemkin, where we get to see his happy life with his wife. There's a few scenes of that where you get to see them interact with each other and they're happy. But like the rest of the characters, the only times we really get strong emotional narratives from them is when something horrible has happened. And I will leave those horrible things as to as non-spoiled for this review. Hopefully I haven't spoiled too much of the book. For a book called Colony Launch, and based on kind of what the preview text for the book is, I hope everybody was not surprised that it's going to be about a colony ship launching. And I hope that I haven't given too much away about the characters and their interactions. But yeah, I would say that if you're a fan of kind of slow-paced space opera kind of stuff, you might find this good. If you like political intrigue, you might find something in this book to enjoy. If you like kind of like criminal redemption stories, I don't know what you'd call it, right? But like that's kind of part of what's going on here, because Dalton Ward is kind of pulled into this group of cold-blooded murderers, and he has to kind of fight between how much he tries to get out and how much he has to maintain the illusion of being in, if that makes sense. Which there are some interesting moments in there that I think someone who likes that kind of story might like to read about. I still think that the getting the spider people onto the colony ship is a little bit treated too simply, but if you're willing to give that a shot, you might enjoy that as well. The thing that worries me about this book are the mystery boxes. I guess the Aryshans stuff is just supposed to kind of provide an impetus for the story. Jon del Arroz has a completely separate, like Aryshan War series that this book is technically a part of on Amazon. It's one of those weird things where I think a book can be a part of multiple series, and the series for this book is the the Colony series. I'm not gonna. I'll avoid spoiling names and stuff like that, but there's supposed to be a series of books based on this colony ship and their adventures on their new planet. And that's supposed to be a new series, but I think this is the only book in that series to begin with. And so right now on Amazon, it's lumped in with the Aryshan War series. And unfortunately, the Aryshan War is an extremely minor element through most of the story. So much so that the back matter for this book, as it stands in the version that I just finished reading, is about one of the Aryshan War novels that is more of a spy thriller than a kind of space it's more of a space drama, right? It's not even space opera, because space opera often has great wars that are the focus of the thing. This is more of a space drama, as opposed to something that is focused on the war. This is deliberately focused away from the war. And apparently the next book that he started working on and has, a preview of at the end of this book is just a spy thriller, which is more of a space opera thing. So I don't know. It's an interesting book. There's going to be people who are going to tell you that this book is terrible simply because of who the author is. And I think that's not useful, right? It's one of those things where, because if I looked at his history. This is my first book from this author that I've read, and it looks like he does a lot more kind of like military space opera stuff and kind of silliness. Like he has a thing called a series called the Baron von Monocle Chronicles or something like that, which maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, maybe it's funny, maybe it's not, maybe it's cringe. I don't know. I haven't read any of it, so I can't tell you. But just based on the name, it sounds silly, in the Monty Python sense. So, it may be that he is more comfortable writing those kinds of sillier, pulpier, more action-packed stories, and this was his attempt to do something a little bit more dramatic. And I would say that it is, it's not like the best space drama I've ever read, but at the same time, it has some interesting elements that I think a person who, likes those kinds of elements might find interesting. So, if you're part of any of those groups that I mentioned a little bit earlier about people that might like this book, I would say go check out the preview, see if you think it might be something that would be worth checking out. It's not bad or semi-literate or politically filled with a hard political message kind of thing. There's actually not much of that. There's almost none of that in the book at all. It's just a book about a few people that are kind of in relatively difficult positions, trying to deal with pushing this thing through and making it happen. And there's a few tragedies and a few victories and a few bits of strangeness that happen throughout the book. But that's kind of what it is. It may be that someday I'll go check out one of his sillier, more action-packed stories and find it's really good. It's one of those things where if you're used to writing stuff that's really silly or really action-packed, you could take a lot of bad shortcuts on your way to writing your first serious drama. So with that in mind, not a bad book at all. Not not mind-blowing either. But it has some interesting elements. It has some elements that I think some people might enjoy. So yeah, that's what I've got. So with that, I'll say have a good weekend. It's Friday, so hopefully you have something fun to do this weekend. I am on draft 7 of the novel now because draft 6 was good. I really liked it, but then I reread the first chapter. I'm like, oh, I need to cut this. And so now I'm going through another trimming session, so we're going to see that. But I did buy a cover for it, which I kind of like for its simplicity. Maybe I'll put a picture of that up here. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, have a good weekend, and I will see you all later. Have a good one.